Chapter 5, An Uneasy Peace. In the early morning hours, before the sun even thought about rising, Pastor Stevens exited his front door and headed to the church. He made his way by the longer route of the sidewalk to avoid the cold and heavy dew. Unlocking the front entrance, the pastor sulked. In any other church this size, there'd be people to help with these Sunday preparations. Ah well, as they say, the Lord's work is never done. First he checked his mailbox in the church secretary's office. He shuffled through some papers absent-mindedly. Nothing that needed dealt with today. The last item caught his attention because he recognized the name on the corner as the head of the deacon board. This might be something important. Opening the letter, he skimmed through. "Pastor, we are again declining your request to hire an assistant at this time. The deacon board feels there are enough able bodies on the board and in the church to take care of any assistance you might need." He sighed and moved on to other business lower down on the page. "At this time, nobody is available to assist with your request to open the doors on Sunday or prepare the communion service items. Please continue to take care of these tasks yourself until someone becomes available." "What?" he exclaimed. "Not again. If there are enough able bodies on the board, then why are none of them ever able to help?" Looking up, he added, "Lord, help me with these people you've given me." The pastor took a deep breath. It's too bad Johnny can't come on Sunday mornings as well. Johnny's help was too indispensable if the orphans were to be ready for church on time, especially since Christine's choir duties prevented her from helping in the kitchen on Sundays. Miss Johnson scraped up the usual batch of scrambled eggs mixed with the leftover meat from Saturday's breakfast. When the older children came down, the girls worked on making and buttering the toast. Today they also stretched the last of the blackberry jam, so that the knife at least touched every piece. Tricia sighed. "Back to plain butter on Monday. Maybe next time we can get grape jelly instead." Miss Johnson rolled her eyes and thought, they should consider themselves lucky to get more jam of any flavor. The boys worked on setting the table and pouring drinks. "Miss Johnson," Terrence announced, "there isn't even enough milk or juice to go halfway around. What should we do?" Miss Johnson furrowed her brow. "Fill glasses until you run out of both. The first of the table gets a choice. The last will have to settle for water. Maybe that'll teach them to be more prompt." After their kitchen jobs, it was back upstairs to get the little ones ready. Everyone had to be ready and downstairs to eat by 8. Johnny woke Elizabeth himself. He knew after the difficulties of the day before that she'd be a little depressed. At times like this, Eliza often said things that were not just rude but downright mean. Sometimes she even shocked herself with the things that came out of her mouth. Johnny understood this was nothing personal, where the others might not. Johnny gently rolled her torso back and forth while quietly announcing, "Good morning, Miss Eliza. It's time to get ready for church." After she'd opened her eyes to look at him, she immediately yawned and gave her arms a big stretch. Once he was sure she was awake, he continued, "You put your dress on and I'll be back to help with the rest." She forcefully pushed Johnny's hand away, but sat up and began to do as he'd instructed. When Johnny came back, her dress was on, but she hadn't buttoned any of the buttons in back or tied the bow in front. This morning, Eliza didn't say much either. She was lost in deep thought. She shirked briskly away from people and gave a fierce look to Alice and later to Tricia as they tried to greet her. Johnny told Elizabeth, "You work on the buttons in the back while I tie the bow in the front." Eliza merely replied with a whining grunt and pushed Johnny's hand away again. But Johnny persisted with the bow. By the time he was done, Eliza finally began working on the buttons. Johnny brushed her loose hair and worked on pinning it so that it would fit properly under her Sunday hat. Eliza complained, "Johnny, the bow is too tight," and began to fuss with it. She eventually had the knot so loose that Johnny had to retie it. Eliza slowly began working on the gloves that matched her dress. One advantage to all the secrecy of her existence was to be the most dressed up of all the girls at church. What the others jealously called the princess treatment. The less her dark skin was visible, the harder for someone to realize she was out of place. Whatever her faults, Eliza had no vanity and failed to see any advantage beyond granting more opportunities to complain. Finally, Eliza broke her relative peace and said, if your parents had loved you, they wouldn't have died and left you. This announcement stunned Johnny, and he needed to turn his head away for a moment. As a young boy, he struggled with this question and with feelings of abandonment. Though he'd come to terms with it years ago, there still were scars on his heart. Johnny told himself, remember, it's because she feels abandoned herself. Johnny rubbed his hand across the top of his head before returning. Eliza! Johnny resumed his work on her hat. You know very well that people don't just up and decide to die on purpose. Not my parents, and not yours either. I don't think any of our parents would have ever left us on purpose, not if there was anything they could have done to prevent it. Johnny, I'm sorry, she stammered. Johnny looked at her face in amazement. Eliza Beth immediately knew she'd crossed the line. It was usually only later, after rehearsing such comments in her bed at night, that she regretted them. She very seldom made it a point to apologize. It seemed better to forget about them as though never spoken. Johnny couldn't remember the last time Eliza apologized for anything. After a moment, she continued, but at least you know about your father, and you can even remember your mother. I don't know one thing about my parents. I don't know their names or what they looked like or anything. I don't like all of this not knowing. They loved you, Eliza, and would have done anything for you if they could have, Johnny explained. Eliza's face changed to a rather quizzical expression. Something had just occurred to her from watching and listening to Johnny's explanation. Then she asked the question of a lifetime, something she'd never thought to ask before. You're saying that like you're talking about a friend or something. Did you know me, my family, and my parents before they died? Johnny shrugged his shoulders and turned to look at her eye to eye. He ran his thumb lightly over the scar on her forehead. Leaning down, he drew her head close until their foreheads touched. Sometimes things have reasons of their own for happening, and it isn't always for us to understand. We can only do so much. Beyond that, what can we do but accept it and move on? The gentle touch made her feel a little warmer inside. For once, she forgot to dwell on the fact that he hadn't answered her question at all. Johnny had no idea of what he should say and was relieved that she didn't push him for an answer. He shook off the thought, ruffled her hair with one hand, and scooped her shoes off the floor with the other. There came a knock at the front door, an unusual event on any day, but particularly on a Sunday. Downstairs, Josie Sue looked out the front window to see Mr. Maxwell's Chevy sedan. Suddenly, she announced, "Cinnamon rolls!" Within seconds, the first round of excited children were already rushing down the stairs, just as Christine was stepping inside. Sometimes Christine surprised the orphans with cinnamon rolls, baked the night before and freshly warmed in her home. She mixed up a double batch and rolled them a bit smaller to have enough for everyone. She dropped them off on her way to choir practice at church. Even the news of the cinnamon rolls did little to stir little Eliza. Johnny pulled her by the hand to get her started, but she still trailed behind. When they finally made it to the table, the others were already close to finishing. Johnny saw Christine through the door to the kitchen. He could tell they were talking in hushed voices, not wanting the children to overhear. This usually meant some sort of bad news. So Johnny figured they were talking about the home's sudden financial troubles. He tried not to dwell on the problem, but he scarcely enjoyed his cinnamon roll at all. Norman, always the slowest eater, barely finished his roll before they heard the horn of the church bus. Every Sunday, Mr. Samuels drove the church's small bus to bring the orphanage residents to services. The children were quite content with the cinnamon rolls filling their stomachs. They were even quieter on the bus than normal. They knew Mr. Samuels wouldn't hesitate to turn the bus around if he thought they were too unsettled for the church service. He'd done it before. The children arrived at church just after service began and went to the east entrance. Nobody used the entrance because the cramped stairs and hall only led to the balcony, which was otherwise unused. Miss Johnson found this convenient since they didn't want the whole congregation to be aware of Eliza, whom not everyone would welcome. Pastor Stephen stood at the door to the church auditorium greeting everyone. After his talk with Christine earlier that morning, he was particularly interested in having a chance to speak with the mayor about the home and the town's apparent lack of compassion. He was rehearsing a 3-point sermon to deliver to the man. The mayor, Jonas Phillips, still managed to sneak in unobserved to his usual seat. Mayor Phillips ran the town and the police chief as though he were a dictator. The mayor didn't quite represent the majority interests of the town, but only the more affluent members. The town's judge, Charles Ransom, and his wife sat in the same pew. He was the mayor's longtime hunting partner. Their relationship helped to maintain the precarious, if lopsided, peace in Townsend. They protected each other and made sure that no complaint against the other ever came to anything. The city council and the courts were mere puppets, and either group could make life difficult for those who sought new leadership. When Pastor Stephen saw the mayor already seated, he sought out the mayor and judge with his hand outstretched. They didn't arise, but casually shook his hand from their seats. They were cordial with him, but distant. They had given up hopes of stirring the new pastor's political ambitions. Making a friend of him could do nothing to profit their plans. Reverend Sigmund, Judge Ransom's brother-in-law, led the church before Pastor Stevens. He was the third spoke in the wheel that ran the town and used the pulpit to push the mayor's agenda more than God's, and largely neglected the needs of the congregation along the way. Through Reverend Sigmund's example, the influential and unscrupulous turned the church into a place for putting themselves on display. The orphanage never dared visit the church in those days. 3 years earlier, Mrs. Sigmund awoke to find her husband lying dead beside her in bed. There was a rumor that a Bible found on the bed was open to Acts chapter 5 with verse 5 underlined in red ink. And as he heard these words, Ananias fell down and breathed his last, and great fear fell over all who heard of it. As Pastor Stevens shook their hands, he asked, "Gentlemen, what are your thoughts on last week's message, Overcoming the Greedy Heart?" The two men shifted uncomfortably in their seats until the mayor apologized. "Sorry, Pastor, this week's city council business has pushed it all right out of my mind." While Mayor Phillips was speaking, the judge took the opportunity to join in a conversation the wives were having and never gave an answer. To guarantee a change, the town needed a new mayor and a new judge at the same time. After the mayor and judge's first election together, they changed the town's constitution so the mayoral election was in even years and the judicial in odd years. At the time, it seemed trivial and easily passed. Over time, people began to realize the result. Now one branch could safely make life difficult for anyone trying to bring change to the other. This was Pastor Stephen's first church position after ministry training. The deacon board offered him the position thinking he'd be easy to control and train up to do things the way they wanted. They hadn't counted on his youthful zeal and passion. The young pastor's approval and opinions were not for sale to the highest bidder like his predecessor. Many of the affluent members tried to make friends with the pastor at first, with lavish personal gifts or donations for church projects. They did so thinking this would allow them to tell the pastor what he could and couldn't preach. As soon as they discovered this wasn't the case, their generosity evaporated. The pastor decided he had better speak his mind. It would have been his preference to discuss the topic in a more private setting. He knew from experience that the mayor always seemed to sneak off whenever there was something important to discuss. "Now, Mayor, I must say that this whole thing about the orphanage and its mortgage is being handled by the city in a most ungracious way. Need I remind you, the good book says we are to look after orphans in their distress. It seems to me that an amicable solution could be worked out." The mayor put on his most businesslike expression and responded, "My dear pastor, looking after orphans and such is certainly a noble endeavor, but someone in my position cannot be making exceptions for anyone and everyone. There is a certain protocol to be followed, mind you." The pastor's cheeks turned a little red. "Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not asking for inappropriate favors or the like. But within all due protocols, there are certain recourses available. There must surely be some process of appeal or of arbitration, perhaps. Certainly you would not turn these orphans out into the street. Pastor, I've spoken my mind on this matter. I will not speak of this any more with you. Good day to you. With that, the mayor turned his back to the pastor and joined in with the judge's conversation. The pastor regained composure and resumed making his rounds. Eventually, the less pretentious members began to arrive, and the pastor went around greeting them. He had a wonderful way of connecting with the common people. If not for this fact, the deacon board might find some reason for dismissal. They were afraid he'd take the commoners with him. They thought, with no one left to influence, why continue with church? Though they couldn't buy Pastor Stevens, he found it necessary to walk a political tightrope. Unfortunately, the work of the church takes money, so the powerful and influential couldn't be entirely ignored. He often thought about leaving all the backbiting, gossiping, and infighting to preach the word in a more receptive climate. Before acting on it, he always remembered Mark chapter 2, verse 17. And when Jesus heard it, he saith unto them, They that are whole have no need of a physician, but they that are sick. I came not to call the righteous, but sinners. He decided it was best to stay where people needed the most help behaving like Christians. Pastor Stevens made it back to the entrance just in time to greet Chief Barton and his wife. The chief was quite friendly with the pastor when he was off duty. In fact, he was like an entirely different man. Reflecting on this, the pastor wondered if someone could teach Mayor Phillips or Judge Ransom how to be off duty. The pastor noticed the chief's smile evaporated as he looked toward the front of the church. Turning around, the pastor saw Mayor Phillips making eye contact with the chief and heading over to talk with him. Chief Barton, the mayor called out. It's always good to see you on the Lord's Day. Shelley, can I please steal your husband away for a moment? Knowing that she really didn't have a choice, she gave a weak half smile and nodded. Mayor Phillips sought out a corner for privacy, but it was only for show because he talked so loudly that everyone could hear. Why didn't you go serve those eviction notices yesterday out to the old Miller place? The mayor began. You know that I have the contractors waiting to start by the middle of the week. Chief Barton was a little more professional and kept his voice low and private. Those observing from behind could only tell the chief was talking by the motion of his hands and his head. A birthday? Mayor Phillips scolded. Come on now, we're not going to hold up a major development for the good of the town over a birthday. I hate to do it, but you always force me into it. Do I have to remind you again about who signs your paychecks? With that, the mayor gave a staged smile, patted him on the arm, and began to walk away. The chief followed him with his head while answering, No, sir, no you don't. Everyone in town was aware of one fact. As long as the mayor or judge wasn't involved, you could count on Chief Barton to uphold the law. Cross the mayor or the judge, and the chief was on their side, or nowhere in sight. Widow Jackson greeted Pastor Stevens. Pastor, you've got to see what I found in the attic, she said, while reaching into her large black canvas purse. Pastor stopped her and made some comment about not feeling it proper to be bringing firearms into the church. The good widow looked shocked and began to explain, How'd you know 'twas a gun? Anyhow, it's an antique, an authentic 22 pepper box, 4-barrel. I believe it's from the Civil War. Besides, I wouldn't bring it to church loaded. Pastor smoothed things over by saying, I don't have time before service to fully appreciate such a rare piece. After service, we can step out in the sunlight and I can take a better look. She agreed, but she really wanted to draw more attention to her find beyond the pastor. By now, almost everyone had arrived and taken their seats. The pastor checked his watch and headed up to the pulpit. He began with a general greeting, an opening prayer, and an introduction of the choir. In the middle of the choir number, the pastor saw Miss Johnson and her charges enter the balcony. He watched as she ushered all the children into the seats. A few people tried to see what he was looking at, but the balcony was too far forward to see from the lower seats. It was customary for the orphans to leave in the middle of the last hymn in order to remain largely unseen. Many of the regular attendees were not even aware the orphans came to church. Other than the pastor, only the choir could see them coming in. Fortunately, they were among those who already knew of Eliza's presence and knew to keep their mouths shut. It bothered Pastor Stevens greatly to see them scurry secretly into the balcony every Sunday. He understood why a degree of secrecy was necessary, but it didn't make it any easier. From the pulpit, he alone could see the way Johnny strived to be there for the younger children, and how he'd grown and matured over the years through this practice. The last item before the pastor's message was for an individual to come forward and sing the special music. A song picked to go with the sermon, and the congregation merely listened and reflected. Johnny looked in the bulletin for today's singer and read, Miss Mary Beth Jameson. He perked up his ears and a wide smile settled on his face as she came to the platform.